It was a quiet Sunday evening in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. The air hung heavy with the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, silent, calm, and tense. The houses sat spaced out along the curved road, their lawns trimmed, porch lights flickering on one by one as the sun slid beneath the horizon. At the end of that road stood a single-story brick house with a white fence, a garden full of marigolds and roses, and a rusted wind chime that never stopped singing in the wind. Inside that house lived Henry and Lorraine Carter, a couple in their late 70s who had been married longer than most people in the neighborhood had been alive. Henry was the kind of man who still ironed his shirts even though he didn't need to anymore. A retired mechanic, his hands were rough but his eyes were gentle. Lorraine was the neighborhood's unofficial grandmother. She made pies for birthdays, soups for sick neighbors, and scolded kids who stayed out too late. They were known for their kindness, for the way their front door always seemed open. To most people, they were just another sweet old couple living out their golden years. But what nobody really talked about, at least not directly, was the quiet pride they carried. The kind that came from raising a son who had once been in the military, someone who rarely visited but always called on Sundays, always asked about their safety, and always told them to keep the doors locked. That night the Carters had just finished dinner. Lorraine was washing dishes while Henry sat at the table reading the newspaper. The local headlines were about construction downtown and a string of burglaries nearby, nothing out of the ordinary. But something about the way the neighborhood dogs had been barking all evening made Henry uneasy. He peered out the window, noticed a black car parked across the street. No headlights, no movement. It wasn't a car he recognized. He told himself not to worry. After all, people park on the street all the time. Maybe it was someone visiting a neighbor. Still, when he checked again 15 minutes later, the car was there. Across town, in a smoky bar near the docks, 3 men sat hunched around a table covered in empty bottles and ashtrays. They weren't locals, at least not anymore. They were part of something that had started small years ago, a little side hustle that had grown into something much bigger, darker, and far more violent. The one in charge, a man named Vito, had a sharp suit, slick hair, and eyes that never stopped moving. He'd come down from New Jersey to handle unfinished business. Beside him sat 2 of his crew, younger, jumpier, trying too hard to look confident. They were here for a job, something that had nothing to do with the Carters, at least not at first. But bad information travels fast, and greed has a way of blinding men who think they're untouchable. The plan was simple: hit a stash house, grab the money, leave no witnesses. But somewhere along the way, someone got the address wrong. Maybe it was a mix-up in the notes, maybe a whispered mistake over the phone. Either way, the house they were supposed to hit wasn't the one with armed guards and dirty cash. It was the Carters' home, a small brick house at the end of a quiet street. As the men drove through the neighborhood, the streets grew emptier, quieter. The younger one, Tony, shifted in his seat, checking the address on the paper. "You sure this is it?" he asked. Vito didn't look up. "Yeah, this is it, just in and out." The third man, called Frankie, tightened his gloves. "Looks too clean for a stash spot," he muttered, his voice low. Vito just smirked. "You think I don't know what I'm doing? Let's get it done." Back at the Carters' house, Lorraine had just finished drying the dishes when she heard a faint noise outside, something like a car door closing, followed by footsteps on gravel. Henry stood up, his body stiff with instinct. He walked to the window again and peered through the blinds. The car was gone now, but he could see shadows moving near the gate. "Lorraine," he said softly, "lock the back door." She didn't ask why. After all these years, she knew the tone in his voice, the one he used when something wasn't right. He moved toward the front door, his heart pounding. Outside, the night was thick, the only sound the faint hum of crickets and that restless wind chime. Then came the first knock, soft, polite even. "Who is it?" Henry called out. No answer. The second knock was harder. Lorraine came to his side, clutching her robe. Henry hesitated before opening the door, just a crack enough to see a man standing there, dressed in black. His face was calm, too calm. What happened next would shake the neighborhood to its core. It would be the story that people whispered about for years, the kind that made folks check their locks twice before bed. But in that moment, there was no chaos, no screaming, just a quiet, creeping dread that hung in the air like smoke. Inside that small home, the world still felt safe for one last moment. The couple didn't know that behind that door were men with orders, men who didn't care who lived there or what they meant to anyone. They didn't know that this mistake would set off a chain of events that would bring their son, a man who had seen war, who had built his life on discipline and control, back into a world he thought he'd left behind. Far away in a dim apartment filled with unpacked boxes and silence, their son Marcus Carter sat alone. He hadn't spoken to his parents in weeks. Work had been busy, life had been heavy, and every time he thought about calling, he told himself he'd do it tomorrow. But as he looked at the photo on his wall, his parents smiling in front of that little brick house, he felt something strange in his chest, something that told him tomorrow might be too late. In that calm before the storm, the world felt still. But underneath that quiet, the darkness was already moving. Cars on the road, guns in the trunk, and a mistake that would destroy everything in its path. The next few days passed quietly in Savannah, but something in the air felt different. The calm had a strange edge to it, like the city itself was holding its breath. The morning after the black car had been parked outside, the Carters went about their day as usual. Henry fixed the squeaky screen door. Lorraine walked to the corner store to buy sugar for her peach cobbler, but both kept glancing over their shoulders. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. They'd both lived long enough to know when something wasn't right. 2 miles away, Vito sat in his rented motel room, staring at the slip of paper with the address scrawled on it. He was furious. The job was supposed to happen the night before, but one of his men had second thoughts at the door. Frankie swore he heard a woman's voice and thought it was the wrong place. Vito had barked at him. "You think we're here to knock on Sunday school doors?" But deep down, even he felt something was off. The plan had started to unravel the moment they got to Savannah. The money they were after belonged to a local dealer who'd been skimming off Mafia profits. Someone tipped Vito off that the stash was hidden in a safe, somewhere in a brick house at the end of the street. The description fit too many places, and the one they picked, the Carters' house, was just a guess. But Vito didn't back down. Pride wouldn't let him. He called in more men, deciding they'd go back that night, make sure it was the right place this time. "We'll go in fast, grab what's there, and leave no witnesses," he told his crew. His voice was sharp, cutting through the smoke-filled air. "No more mistakes." That night, the Carters' phone rang. Lorraine picked it up, expecting it to be one of her church friends, but when she heard her son's voice on the line, something inside her softened. "Marcus," she said, her tone brightening. It had been weeks. They talked for a while about the garden, the neighbors, the dog down the street that wouldn't stop barking, but Marcus could tell something in her voice was off. She sounded distracted, like she was trying to sound calm, but was. "Mom, is everything all right?" he asked. She hesitated. "Of course, sweetheart, everything's fine, just a little on edge lately. You know how quiet it gets around here." He almost believed her. But when she mentioned the strange car outside a few nights back, his military instincts kicked in. After hanging up, Marcus couldn't shake the unease. He had spent years in Delta Force, running operations in places where every shadow could mean danger. He knew the feeling of being watched, of something moving beneath the surface. He checked the clock. It was nearly midnight, but his mind wouldn't rest. He decided to drive down to Savannah the next morning. He told himself it was just to visit, to surprise them. But deep down, he already knew something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Vito's crew was spiraling. Tony, the youngest, couldn't stop thinking about the couple in that house. "Their old man," he muttered as they loaded their guns in the car. "You sure this is the place?" Frankie gave him a look. "You think the boss wants to waste time? He said it's the place, so it's the place." But even Frankie's hands shook when he said it. The pressure was getting to them. Money had gone missing from the last job. One of their guys had been found dead in New Jersey execution style. The higher-ups were watching them, expecting results. Failure wasn't an option. As the sun went down, the black car rolled slowly through the neighborhood again. Kids were playing outside, chasing each other with sticks. A mailman waved at the car. The men didn't wave back. They parked a block away this time, waiting until the street went dark. Lorraine sat by the window, knitting, unaware that death was watching from the shadows. Henry was in his recliner, dozing off to an old movie. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the sound of seconds slipping away. Back in his apartment, Marcus couldn't sleep. He cleaned his old pistol, a habit he hadn't shaken since the army. He hadn't fired it in years, but the familiar weight in his hand steadied him. Around 3 a.m., he finally packed a bag, grabbed his keys, and hit the road. The drive to Savannah was long and quiet, the kind of silence that gives your mind too much space to wander. He kept seeing his mother's face in his head, the way her voice trembled when she said, "Strange car." He tried to tell himself it was nothing, but his gut wouldn't let it go. As Marcus drove south, the tension in Savannah reached its peak. Inside the motel, Vito was packing. He'd just gotten off the phone with his contact up north, who was furious. "You're late," the voice said. "You think we're running a charity? You bring me that cash or don't bother coming back." Vito slammed the phone down. His men watched him quietly, afraid to say a word. "We move tonight," he said. "No more waiting. I don't care who's in that house." Tony wanted out. "We can't just kill people if it's not the right place," he said, his voice low. Vito turned on him, grabbed him by the collar. "You think you get to pick who dies now? You're here because you owe me. You don't get a conscience tonight." The room went silent. That was the moment something broke in all of them. The fear, the anger, the pressure, it twisted together until there was no space left for doubt. By the time Marcus reached Savannah, dawn was breaking. The first light of morning painted the streets in pale gold. He drove past his childhood park, the diner where his parents used to take him after church, the little gas station that hadn't changed in 20 years. Everything looked the same, yet it all felt different. He parked a few blocks from his parents' house, scanning the area the way he used to scan villages overseas, every car, every shadow, every sound. He saw it right away, the black sedan sitting at the edge of the street. The windows were tinted. The license plate was partially covered with mud. Marcus's pulse spiked. He didn't move for a minute, he just watched. Two men were sitting inside, talking. A third one stood outside, smoking, glancing toward his parents' home. Marcus's training kicked in instantly. He grabbed his binoculars from the glove compartment, zoomed in on the car. The men didn't look like locals. Their posture, their eyes, they were alert, tense, ready. Marcus dialed his mother's number. No answer. He tried again, still nothing. He started the engine, heart pounding so loud it felt like it filled the car. But before he could pull away, one of the men from the sedan started walking toward the Carter's house. That was when Marcus knew. This wasn't a coincidence. Inside the house, Lorraine was setting the table for breakfast when she heard footsteps outside. Henry looked up from his coffee. "They're back," he whispered. He reached for the phone, but it was too late. The doorknob started to turn. Marcus floored the gas pedal, his car lurching forward. The sound of tires screeching broke the silence of the street. The men by the sedan turned, startled. One of them reached for his gun. Marcus slammed the brakes in front of the house, jumped out, weapon drawn, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Step away from the door." For a split second, time stopped. The old man inside froze, Lorraine's hand trembled over the counter, and the three men outside hesitated, caught between confusion and fear. They didn't know who he was, just that he wasn't supposed to be there. The tension that had been building for days, for years even, finally cracked open in that moment. What started as a job gone wrong was now something else entirely. It was personal. The men didn't know it yet, but the house they had chosen by mistake belonged to someone whose son had been trained for situations far worse than this. Someone who didn't flinch when the world turned violent. And as the morning sun climbed higher, the first shot echoed through the street, sharp, final, and inevitable. It was the sound that shattered everything, the fragile peace of that quiet neighborhood, the illusion that evil always came from somewhere else. From that moment on, nothing in Savannah would ever be the same again. The morning sun had barely risen, but the quiet street had already turned into a battlefield. The birds that usually chirped outside the Carters' windows scattered as the first gunshot ripped through the still air. The sound echoed between the houses, sharp and violent, tearing through the peace that had blanketed the neighborhood for decades. Inside the small brick home, Lorraine screamed. Henry lunged toward her, pushing her down behind the counter just as the front door burst open. The men came in fast, masks on, weapons drawn. Vito barked orders as if this were just another job, his voice cold, his movements precise. "Check the back, no one gets out," he yelled. But his voice carried a slight tremor. He hadn't expected resistance. Not here, not in this quiet old house that smelled like cinnamon and coffee. Marcus hit the ground outside, rolling behind a parked car, his eyes locked on the front door. Every instinct he'd ever honed in the field came flooding back. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened. He counted two men inside, one outside guarding the car. He could hear Lorraine's cries, muffled but desperate. He couldn't wait. He moved low, fast, keeping to the shadows of the fence line, circling toward the back of the house. Inside, Henry tried to stand. "Please just take what you want," he said, his voice shaking. Frankie, the taller of the two intruders, looked uneasy. His gun wavered slightly as he aimed it. "We don't want trouble, old man. Just tell us where the safe is." Henry's brow furrowed. "Safe? We don't have a—" But before he could finish, Vito struck him hard with the butt of his gun. Lorraine screamed again, reaching for her husband, but Frankie pulled her back, muttering, "Don't make this worse, lady." Henry fell to the floor, blood pooling slowly from a cut above his temple. He tried to speak, but his words came out weak, broken. Lorraine crawled toward him, whispering his name, her hands trembling. The house filled with noise, the creak of boots, the crash of drawers being yanked open, the hiss of fear in the air. Out back, Marcus reached the kitchen window. Through the glass, he could see his mother on the floor, her gray hair matted with tears, her body shaking. His father wasn't moving. Marcus's hands clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. Every fiber of his being screamed for action, but he couldn't rush in blindly. He crouched low, unholstered his gun, and drew a slow, deep breath. Vito moved through the living room, furious. "Where's the damn money?" he shouted. "You think you can hide from us?" He kicked over a chair, breathing hard. Frankie looked up, panic in his eyes. "Vito, I don't think this is the right place," he whispered. "There's nothing here," but Vito didn't care. He'd gone too far to back out now. His pride, his fear, and his rage had fused into something uncontrollable. Henry groaned softly, and Vito turned, raising his weapon. Lorraine threw herself over her husband, sobbing. "Please, he's sick. We don't have anything. Please just leave us alone." For a brief second, Vito hesitated. He saw the fear in her eyes, the kind he'd seen 100 times before, but there was something different about this, something human, and it scared him. That hesitation was all Marcus needed. He smashed the back door open and stormed in, his weapon up. "Drop it!" he shouted, his voice loud, commanding, filled with a power that froze everyone in the room. Vito turned, startled. Frankie's gun jerked upward, shaking. Lorraine gasped when she saw her son. "Marcus!" she whispered. Time fractured into pieces. Marcus fired first, the shot hitting Frankie square in the shoulder. The man stumbled back, screaming, his gun flying out of his hand. Vito dove behind the couch, returning fire. The gunshots shattered picture frames, tore through walls, filled the air with smoke and dust. Lorraine crawled toward the corner, dragging Henry with her. Marcus moved like he'd done this 1,000 times. His eyes tracked every movement, his breathing steady even as bullets ripped past his head. He ducked behind the kitchen counter, reloaded, and shouted, "It's over, drop your weapons!" But Vito was past reason. He fired blindly, rage and panic mixing in his veins. "You don't know who you're messing with," he screamed. Marcus popped up, fired twice. The first shot missed. The second didn't. Vito's body slammed back against the wall, his gun clattering to the floor. For a heartbeat, the house went silent except for the ringing in everyone's ears. Then came the sound of Lorraine's sobs, raw and broken. Marcus dropped his weapon and rushed to his parents. "Mom, Dad, it's okay," he said, his voice shaking now, all the adrenaline melting away. Lorraine clutched his arm, crying, "Henry, he's hurt, Marcus." Marcus pressed his hand to his father's wound. Henry's eyes fluttered open. "Son," he whispered weakly, "I knew you'd come." Marcus felt his throat tight. "Don't talk, Dad, stay with me." But the third man, the one outside, had heard the gunfire. He stormed in, eyes wild, firing before he even saw who he was shooting at. The bullet hit Lorraine. She gasped, her body jerking violently before collapsing in Marcus's arms. The world stopped moving. Marcus's mind went blank. There was no sound, no air, just the weight of his mother's body going limp. Something inside him broke. He spun around, eyes blazing, and fired without hesitation. The man outside didn't even get a second shot. Marcus hit him center mass. He fell instantly, crashing through the doorway. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, thick and heavy. Then silence, real silence, the kind that feels alive pressing against your chest. Marcus dropped to his knees beside his mother, his hands shaking as he tried to stop the bleeding. Mom, stay with me," he said, but her eyes were already fatting. He pulled her close, his face buried in her shoulder. No. His voice broke into pieces. Henry's weak voice came from the floor. "Marcus, she's gone." Marcus didn't answer. He just held them both, his body shaking uncontrollably. Outside, a neighbor peeked through her window, eyes wide, dialing 911 with trembling hands. Sirens started in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder, closer. Marcus stayed where he was, surrounded by chaos, broken glass, blood, and the wreckage of everything that once felt safe. When the police finally arrived, they found Marcus sitting on the floor, his gun set neatly beside him, his parents in his arms. The officers shouted commands, guns drawn, but Marcus didn't move. He stared straight ahead, his face blank, tears still running down his cheeks. The house smelled like death and smoke. The old wind chime outside clinked faintly in the breeze, as if mocking the silence that had fallen inside. As the officers led him outside, the sun had fully risen. Neighbors stood on their lawns, whispering. No one knew what had really happened, only that the quiet couple at the end of the street were gone, and their son had come home just in time to witness the end of everything. Marcus looked up at the sky, eyes burning. There was no satisfaction, no relief, just a hollow ache where his heart used to be. He had spent years fighting wars in faraway places, but he'd never imagined the worst battle of his life would happen in his parents' living room. And in that moment, as the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the shattered windows, the truth settled in like a weight he could never lift. The men who brought violence into his family's home were dead, but so was the only peace he'd ever known. The days after the shooting moved in slow motion and then all at once. At first, everything felt unreal, like Marcus was walking through someone else's life. The police station smelled of coffee and paper. Officers took his statement over and over while the same questions circled like vultures. What did you see? Who fired first? Why did you shoot? He answered as best he could, but the words felt flat. Later, in the quiet of an interview room, the memory came back in sharp slices. The slam of the door, his mother's cry, the way his father's hand went limp. He said those things out loud, but they did not change the rawness that sat under his skin. Neighbors gathered in small groups on porches, talking in low voices. Some brought casseroles and blankets for the family. A woman from the church organized a schedule so someone would be at the house during the day. The front yard was filled with flowers, cards, and candles, and sometimes people would stand there in silence as if memorials could hold the world together. Others leaned closer to their phones, reading every headline and every rumor that spread faster than the facts. News vans lined the street for 3 days. Cameras and microphones made private grief into a public spectacle, and that was its own kind of violence. The police did what police do. They sealed rooms, bagged evidence, and took photographs of every bullet hole and broken frame. Forensics ran tests that felt clinical against the very human wreckage: fingerprints, gunshot residue, blood patterns. Detectives interviewed neighbors, checked traffic cameras, and traced the black sedan back to a rental company. Word came that Vito had ties outside the state, that he was not a small-time crook. That detail brought in a different badge. The FBI showed up and introduced themselves with a slow, official gravity that made Marcus feel very small. Marcus was not arrested for long. He was read his rights, handcuffed, and led out of the house under the flashing red and blue lights, which all the neighbors watched like a scene from a movie. But the evidence pointed toward self-defense. The men had forced their way in, had weapons, and one of them had fired at close range. Still, the law can be a blunt instrument when grief and violence are involved. Marcus was questioned for hours. He answered. He told them about the nights he'd spent learning to wait, how he'd trained for split-second choices, how the image of his mother bleeding never left him. When the medical examiner confirmed Lorraine's death, everything narrowed to a single fact that would not leave his chest. Grief did not look like people expected. Marcus moved through prayer services and the funeral with the same steady, controlled manner he had in the field. Outside, he was sharp and quiet. Inside, the world had become a loud place full of small, unbearable things. He replayed every moment, how long it took him to decide to go home, whether he might have done something different, whether a different word could have stopped it. He felt the strange weight of having killed men, even though they had tried to kill his parents. He had spent his life being trained to harm when asked. This was different. The harm had landed in his hands when he had come home. Community reaction split in ways that felt personal. Some neighbors treated him like a hero, offering a hand and quiet looks that said, without words, at least they were safe from those men now. An older man who'd known Henry for 20 years stood in the yard and shook Marcus's hand until the younger man's fingers went numb. At the same time, others watched him with something harder: suspicion, fear, a whispered question about what it meant that such violence had erupted in their middle-class street. A few people muttered about vigilantism, about the danger of a private person taking the law into his own hands. Social media turned the case into a debate. Strangers assigned motives, judged decisions, and tried to reduce complex grief into clean arguments. Legal consequences stretched out in formal ways. Detectives and prosecutors pieced the case together. They had witness statements, forensic reports, ballistics, and the battered rental agreement for Vito's car. The surviving intruder, Frankie, survived with a wound to his shoulder and a mouth full of lies. He claimed they were only there to scare a man who owed money, that killing anyone wasn't the plan. The story he gave did not match all the evidence. Still, he spoke to lawyers and guarded his words. Prosecutors weighed charges. They considered whether Marcus acted within the bounds of self-defense and whether any charges against him or his late parents would make sense legally or morally. The FBI's interest complicated things. Organized crime carried different risks and different resources. They wanted to know who Vito answered to, what network he belonged to, and whether this mistake meant more violence for the town. That meant more interviews for Marcus, more reports for the detectives, more subpoenas for bank records and phone logs. It also meant press releases and the slow, grinding movement of federal investigations that can drag grief for years. For Marcus, it was a new kind of exposure. His life dissected by men in suits who asked the same clinical questions doctors had asked in the hospital. The personal cost went deeper than legal papers. Marcus lost the thin sense of safety that had lived in his chest all his life. He could not sleep without waking in sweats. The smells and sounds of the house, coffee, cinnamon, the creak of the kitchen chair, haunted him. In the quiet hours, he replayed his last conversation with his mother, the call he'd promised to make more often. Guilt is a quiet animal that lingers in corners. He thought about all the things he had not said, the small resentments and the missed calls. He blamed himself for not being there sooner, even though everyone told him he had nothing to blame himself for. It did not help. The army taught him to be responsible, and responsibility now turned inward into a prison. Friends and old comrades reached out. Some called him a hero, some kept their distance. The VA offered counseling, and eventually Marcus agreed to see a therapist. Sitting in that office, he found words he had not expected: survivor's guilt, moral injury, the impossible mix of relief and horror when a threat ends in death. The therapist did not offer simple fixes. Healing, if it came, would be small. Marcus began to take the steps. Small, dull things, appointments, paperwork, a return to a rhythm that blinked like a distant shore. For the neighborhood, the world changed. Police lights did not go away, patrols increased, and people who once left their doors open began to lock them. The church that had been a quiet place for Sunday visits held a funeral that pulled the community inward for a day. Lorraine and Henry lay there in their best clothes, their faces somehow unchanged by what had happened, and people leaned on each other through shared sorrow. Marcus spoke at the service, and his words were plain and short. He talked about his parents' kindness, about how ordinary their love had been. He did not speak of war. He left that for later. A few weeks after the funeral, strangers in cars started parking near the house again, but this time to leave newspapers instead of cash. The media cycle moved on slowly, then faster, and the story settled into the background of local life. But the family, what remained of it, became smaller. Papers had to be filed for wills and insurance policies. Small bureaucratic tasks arrived like another kind of wound: forms to prove death, letters from banks asking for names, calls from lawyers. Those details did not feel like closure. They felt mechanical, rude steps taken by a world that kept moving while his world had stopped. Marcus began to understand, with a cold clarity, that the murder of his parents would not be a single event in his life. It was a crack that ran every which way, changing the map of his future. He would be questioned in courts of law and in the quieter courts of neighbors and strangers. Some would call him a protector. Others would mutter about the danger of trained men living among us. He would go on interviews if asked, and he would refuse some offers for money and attention because his parents had never wanted the spotlight. He would also carry with him the small comforts they left behind: a chipped mug from Lorraine's kitchen cabinet, a toolbox with Henry's name carved into it. Those objects became talismans against forgetting. In private, Marcus let himself break. He screamed into pillows and drove until the road blurred. He visited his father's tool shed and sat among the orderly rows of wrenches and sockets like a man in a foreign country. Over time, the sharpest edges dulled just enough for him to breathe. Justice moved slowly, in the form of grand jury timelines and prosecutors' notes. Public opinion, when it came, was messy and shifting. The street where the Carters had lived remained quiet in different ways. People walked more carefully. They watched their doors, and some, in the small hours, still stood at the corner where the wind chime used to sing, and listened to the empty sounds of a life that used to belong to two simply kind people. The fallout never stopped arriving completely. There were phone calls about threats, about someone else connected to Vito who wanted revenge. There were times Marcus checked the corners of his house at night, fingers on the piano wire of a rifle he had promised himself he would never touch again. But there were also small acts of kindness that reached him like soft lights: meals dropped off, a neighbor mowing the lawn, the church keeping funds for a headstone. Those things did not fix the whole, but they made the days after bearable in a way that later, in the quiet, felt like a first step toward living with the loss rather than being swallowed by it. When the dust settled and the legal papers were signed, the case left a long trail of small, hard facts and even more questions that had no neat answers. Prosecutors looked at the pictures, the bullet paths, the statements, and the rental records. They had a clear scene: a forced entry, guns, and a man who came home to find his parents under attack. The surviving intruder, badly wounded, told a story that changed like the tides. He blamed the men who sent them, but he also wanted a deal. The Mafia connection drew federal agents and a slow-moving investigation that reached into other states. In the end, local prosecutors decided not to charge Marcus with a crime. The evidence and the witness accounts lined up with self-defense. It is a cold kind of relief to be told you won't go to prison, and Marcus felt that cold. He did not celebrate. He sat in quiet, and the fact that he had fired the shots that ended men's lives and could not bring his mother back. Frankie, wounded and angry, survived long enough to face a courtroom. He pleaded guilty to armed robbery and to his role in the breaking. His sentence felt like a small thing next to everything else, but it was something the court could do. Vito, the man who led the job, was dead in the living room with coffee on his breath and a newspaper still folded on the couch. The federal case widened and then narrowed. The people at the higher levels of that crime family were harder to reach. They could hide in layers of middlemen and shell companies. Agents made arrests over the next year, quiet moves that did not unmake the damage done to the Carter's family. Some charges stuck. Others vanished into plea deals and slow legal maneuvers. Justice, in the narrow legal sense, arrived in fits and starts, some bodies in prison, some names merely whispered in sealed files. Marcus paid other prices that the courts could not touch. The public could not agree on what he was. News outlets painted him in broad strokes, a veteran who saved his parents, a man who took the law into his own hands, a tragic figure. Social media argued and judged. His name was on microphones and talk shows for a few weeks, then disappeared. The neighborhood offered comfort in small, steady ways. People brought food and sat with him when the nights were loud. But there were differences in the way the world treated him and the way it treated his parents. The fact that Henry and Lorraine were black added lines and angles to the story that could not be ignored. The neighborhood had loved them as neighbors. The wider world sometimes saw their death as a footnote in a bigger story about crime and guns. The family's grief did not fit neatly into talking points about race, but it lived there anyway, woven into the way people talked about safety, about who the city's problems belonged to, and about how easily violence can move in when people assume it belongs somewhere else. Marcus left some things behind and kept others close. He quit the teams and the missions that let him disappear into a language of orders and objectives. He moved into his parents' house because he could not bear the idea of selling it, and because he believed in a stubborn way that the house should keep the memory of those rooms alive. Sitting at the kitchen table, he found small rituals that helped him breathe. Fixing the fence, tending Lorraine's roses, making Henry's coffee the way his hands remembered. These acts did not heal everything, but they made the mornings less sharp. He began to see a counselor regularly, and eventually, to speak to veterans who had done similar hard things. He found a kind of work helping others who returned from war and found home harder than the battlefield. It was not a grand redemption. It was slow, human work that kept his hands busy and gave him space to learn how to live with the memory of that morning without being swallowed by it. The community changed, too. People who had once thought of trouble as something that happened in other places realized it could find a way into their small street. The church that had organized casseroles began a neighborhood watch that worked with the police and offered a phone list for everyone on the block. Some residents argued that those changes would not stop problems that come from deeper causes: poverty, addiction, and the ways organized crime finds gaps in people's lives. Others wanted to make sure the police presence stayed near the houses where the elderly lived alone. The argument between fixing root causes and fixing visible symptoms never resolved cleanly, but it did push people to talk. It pushed local leaders to think about who had power in the city and how that power could be used to protect or to harm. On a deeper level, the case asked hard questions about how we measure right and wrong when everything is tangled. Marcus had trained to do violence in the service of missions. He had learned rules and constraints that made sense in war and sometimes did not in a quiet home. When the men pushed their way in, the moral code he had lived by came alive in a burst of action. Later, he wrestled with the feeling that, in killing the intruders, he had also killed a part of himself. Guilt and duty sat together in his chest. He felt angry at the men who came to his parents' door, at the systems that allowed organized crime to spread, and at his own delay in answering the phone more often. He learned that justice and mercy do not always sit on the same bench. The case also exposed how power acts in hidden ways. The men who sent Vito took advantage of a world where money could move in secret, where violence could be outsourced to others, and where fear was a tool to get what they wanted. For some people in the neighborhood, that was the real crime: how distant decisions, made by people in other places, landed like blows on the heads of ordinary people. It raised the question of who pays for the safe life others enjoy in bigger parts of the city, and it made clear that violence often follows the lines of money and access. Legally, the record would show what it had to: a home invasion, a robbery attempt, a self-defense shooting that had cost a life. Socially, the court of public opinion would keep arguing about the rightness of Marcus's actions. But in private rooms where the funeral flowers wilted and wills were read, the losses were simpler and more brutal. A mother who would not call again, a father who would not iron another shirt. These were the facts that did not fit into headlines. They fit only into the shape of a life that was now missing two people who had filled a house with small kindnesses. Years later, Marcus would still catch a scent of cinnamon and feel the world tilt. He would still wake sometimes and count his breath, just to know the numbers moved. But time did what it always does. It added layers over the raw places. He learned to be present at small things, gardens in spring, a neighbor's child coming by to borrow a wrench, the quiet satisfaction of fixing a door that had always stuck. He learned to speak plainly about the loss without trying to make it heroic or larger than it was. The town learned to keep its eyes open and to ask harder questions about who is left out of safety. In the end, there was no single moral that neatly tied the story into a lesson. There was only a long unspooling of consequences that touched law, community, and the private heart. The crime had left scars on people and places, and it pushed others to act in small ways that mattered. Justice in the courts moved at its own pace and left behind its patchwork. For Marcus, the most lasting change was not legal. It was personal, a map redrawn by grief and responsibility. He was still a man who could move fast in a crisis, but he now carried the knowledge of how fragile peace can be and how easily it can be taken. He would go on living with that knowledge, trying in small ways to make sure the house at the end of the street kept its doors closed to those who would harm, and open only in the ways his parents had taught him, by offering a hand, a meal, a place to sit when the world outside felt too loud.